Caffeine is a widely consumed psychoactive drug and stimulant, and is found in over 60 different types of plants, most commonly, however, in coffee and tea. In this video, I'll be showing you how to extract it from instant coffee using a solvent known as dichloromethane. The only chemicals that I'll need for this extraction are obviously the coffee itself, as well as some sodium carbonate and some distilled water. To start, I weigh out about 10 grams of instant coffee, followed by 4 grams of sodium carbonate. The sodium carbonate serves to neutralize many different chemicals in the coffee that are unwanted, and this will make them more water soluble, which will allow us to extract only caffeine into the DCM. Here I'm using instant coffee because it saves me a filtration step. However, it does contain less caffeine than ground coffee beans, so I could potentially get a higher yield by using coffee beans instead of instant coffee. Distilled water is then added to the coffee sodium carbonate mixture until a volume of 80 milliliters is reached. Then, the mixture is placed on a hot plate, and strong heating and stirring are turned on. The mixture is then heated to a boil to ensure all solids have dissolved. It should be noted that it has a tendency to foam and boil over, which actually happened to me, so it's a good idea to cover the beaker with a watch glass to prevent foaming over. This also limits water loss. Once all solids have dissolved, the beaker is taken off the hot plate and left to cool. It is then filtered through a coffee filter into a separatory funnel. Once the mixture is just above room temperature, a small amount of dichloromethane is added. You can see that I was impatient, and when I added it, the dichloromethane boiled because it was still too hot. You should at all costs avoid this. The separatory funnel is then capped, shaken, and vented. Venting this properly is crucial for this step. Unfortunately for me, an emulsion formed, and I even tried to break the emulsion with a saltwater solution, but this was to no avail. If this happens to you, the best thing is simply to let the mixture sit for 24 hours and let the emulsion separate. I was impatient, so I simply cooked up another batch instead. Anyways, the next step is to drain the lower DCM layer into a separate container, which will then be later used for distillation. A simple distillation was then set up, and the DCM was boiled off and recovered for later use. It's crucial to do this in a very well ventilated area, since DCM boils at 39 degrees Celsius and it's very volatile, and its fumes aren't exactly healthy to breathe in. And here you can see the product of crude caffeine at the bottom of the flask. An arbitrary amount of water is then added to the flask and heated to a boil. This serves to dissolve all solids present in the flask and will help us transfer them to another beaker. Once all the solids have dissolved, I take the flask off the heat and transfer all of its contents into a separate beaker. This solution now contains our crude caffeine as well as a bunch of other impurities, which is why it's yellow. The solution is then heated and the water is driven off. It's important not to boil to dryness, since our product can burn. I then transfer our product, which has been dried, to a watch glass, and to be honest, it kind of looked like peanut butter, but I definitely don't recommend eating this. I was kind of disappointed that it was so contaminated, but I think next time I should use more sodium carbonate to make sure all of the organics become water soluble, and I'm only left with caffeine in the final product. Anyways, the next step is to purify this by recrystallization, so I dissolve it in a small amount of methanol, which is then placed in the freezer. Then, the crystals which form are filtered off by vacuum. They are then washed several times with a small amount of ice-cold methanol. As you can see, most of the brown contamination has stayed in the filtrate, which means that our crystals should be relatively pure. The vacuum is then left on for about half an hour to ensure all the crystals are dry. They are then transferred onto a watch glass to be weighed. As you can see, we obtained a terrible yield of 40 milligrams of crude caffeine. This still isn't super pure because the crystals are still kind of brown, but if I were to recrystallize this again, I would probably lose most of the caffeine, so I decided to just leave it at that. As I've mentioned previously, in some upcoming videos, I'll be showing how to purify sulfuric acid, how to concentrate hydrogen peroxide, and many other projects. I'll also be demonstrating in an upcoming video how to make chloroform using the haloform reaction. If you enjoyed this video, subscribing for more upcoming content. I've also just started a Patreon page, which I'll be linking in the description if any of you are interested in donating. In the future, I'll be making some bigger projects, which can be quite expensive, so any help is very much appreciated.